Hola clase! Today we're going to talk about direct and indirect object pronouns, primarily focusing on indirect objects and indirect object pronouns. So, first of all, have your note guide out and ready, and we're going to focus on indirect object pronouns. To figure out what a complemento indirecto, or indirect object pronoun is in a sentence, you have to figure out to or for whom something is given or done. A lot of times if you ask whom, you can figure out what the indirect object is in a sentence. So here's the first sentence. It says, Les escribo un email a mis padres. First of all, the subject is yo. I wrote what? I wrote an email, and an email is the direct object. To whom? My parents. A mis padres. So in this situation, the indirect object is a mis padres, and the indirect object is les. Let's talk a little bit about indirect objects and indirect object pronouns. Before we go on, stop the video and answer question number 1. Here are some more examples of sentences that have indirect objects in them. I bought what? Or I bought this present for you. Compró este regalo para ti. I bought what? A present. Present is the direct object. For whom? For you. Para ti is the indirect object. Les escribo un email a mi hermano. I write an email to my brother. I write what? An email. An email is the direct object. To whom? My brother. So, a mi hermano and le is an indirect object pronoun. So, in Spanish, I can use indirect objects and indirect object pronouns in the same sentence. This is different than the English language because we usually don't do this. Answer number 2 on the note guide before going on. Here are some more examples of sentences that have indirect objects and indirect object pronouns in them. Compró los libros para mis hermanos. I buy the books for my brothers. I buy what? Books. For whom? For my brothers. Para mis hermanos or hermanos is the indirect object in the sentence. Les escribes un SMS a tus amigos. You write them to your friends, referring to a text message. A tus amigos is the indirect object, and les is the indirect object pronoun that goes with it. Mi amigo me da un regalo. My friend gives me a present. And me and regalo is the indirect object and indirect object pronoun. As you can see, me goes before the conjugated verb. The conjugated verb right here is da. So in Spanish, indirect object pronouns go before the conjugated verb. So in Spanish, here are the most common indirect objects. Me, te, le, nos, and les. Me standing for myself, te standing for yourself, le standing for him or herself, nos standing for themselves, and les standing for themselves. Here are some examples of more sentences with direct and indirect object pronouns in the sentence. Mi novio me envía muchos mensajes de texto, or la profesora nos da mucha tarea. A lot of times when I'm trying to figure out what the what the subject, direct object, and indirect object pronoun in the sentence, I like to start out simple. So, first of all, identify what the subject is in the sentence. Then, number 2, identify the se de, or direct object, or complemento directo. Remember from the last segment, we ask what or que to figure out what this direct object pronoun is. And 3, figure out what the direct object pronoun or the indirect object pronoun is in a sentence. And remember, a lot of times we can ask whom to figure out what this is. So, for example, in mi novio me envía muchos mensajes de texto, novio is the subject. My boyfriend sent what? Sent many messages. Messages is the direct object pronoun. To whom? To me. Me is the indirect object pronoun in this situation. La profesora nos da mucha tarea. The professor gives a lot of homework. The professor gives what? Homework. To whom? To us. Profesora is the subject. Tarea is the direct object, and nos is the indirect object pronoun. Let's look at some more examples. So, here are some examples of sentences with indirect object pronouns in them. A lot of these sentences also have the indirect object with it as well. What I want you to do is I want you to choose the noun that corresponds to the indirect object that's in the parentheses. So number 1 says, a Jaime le gusta el tenis y lo practica frecuentemente con Carlos. Jaime practices tennis and he practices it frequently with Carlos. What is le referring to? Is it referring to tenis, Jaime, or Carlos? In this situation, it's referring to Jaime. Number 2, les digo a mis hijas que no puedan ver esos programas con sus amigos. I tell my daughters that they're not able to watch these programs with their friends. I tell whom? My daughters. So you have to think to yourself, what is les standing for? Les is standing for hijas in this situation. Number 3, ellas no muestran a Pilar y mí los mejores métodos para preparar la comida. She demonstrates to Pilar and I the best methods to prepare the food. She demonstrates to whom? To Pilar and I. So, in this situation, Pilar y yo is what the indirect object is referring to. So, before we go on, I want you to stop the video and I want you to focus on questions 3 and 4. These are similar to the sentences that we just went over, but they are different. So right now, I want you to figure out what the indirect object is in the sentences. Circle the best one. So now let's switch it up a bit. We were figuring out what the indirect object was. Let's do just a few more. But now we are talking about the indirect object pronoun. So, right here, it says, me gustó mucho la película. Espero que blank gusta a ti. I liked the movie. I hope that you like it. So, in this situation, we need to use the indirect object pronoun that stands for you. So, we would use te. Number 2, Esteban, explica blank a tu colega por qué no estás de acuerdo. Esteban, explain to your colleague why you aren't in agreement. So, you need an indirect object pronoun that stands for colega or colleague. So you need one that stands for him or her. In this situation, we would use the indirect object pronoun le. Number 3, mis padres siempre blank decían a mi hermana y a mí que no era apropiada hablarle así a una persona mayor. My parents always say to my brother and I that we're not able to talk like this to an older person. So the indirect object is my brother and I. So we need an indirect object pronoun that would stand for us. So in this situation, it would be nos. So what I want you to do right now is I want you to stop the video and I want you to focus on 5 and 6. So right now you need to pick the appropriate indirect object pronoun that would go with these indirect objects. These are very similar to what we just went over. Here are some more sentences that have indirect objects and indirect object pronouns in them. So here it says, Héctor, no vendas tu bicicleta a Clara. Héctor, don't sell your bicycle to Clara. So Clara is the indirect object pronoun. Sells what? The bicycle. To whom? To Clara. So we need the indirect object pronoun le to go with it. Number 2, María and Ana, ustedes salieron mal en el último examen. Blank sugiero que vengan a mi oficina. Maria and Anna, you all didn't get a very good grade on the last test. How about, I want that all of you come to my office. So I need an indirect object pronoun that would go with Maria and Ana. In this situation, it would be les. Number 3, no entendemos. ¿Podría usted explicar, blank, otra vez la gramática? We don't understand. Would you be able to explain it to us? So in this situation, the indirect object pronoun that would go with us would be nos. Remember, indirect object pronouns attach to infinitives. So now I want you to practice using, or I just want you to be familiar with using indirect objects, and these are the most common verbs that are used with indirect object pronouns. Dar, to give something to someone; decir, to say something to someone; gustar, to be pleasing to someone; molestar, to be bothersome to someone; regalar, to give something to someone; and vender, to sell something to someone. When we come to class the next time that we meet, we're going to practice using indirect object pronouns with these verbs. So what I want you to do now, on your note guide, I want you to answer these questions. Now, you're going to be, in some situations, you're going to be using direct object pronouns, and in some situations, you're going to be using indirect object pronouns. I'll give you a hint. On number 1 and 2, you're using direct object pronouns. So you'll be using direct object pronouns like lo, la, los, and las. On number 3 and 4, you're going to be using indirect object pronouns. So, for example, let's just let me do number 1 with you to kind of to get you started. Number 1 says, "Tiene tatuajes?" Does he or she have tattoos, or do you have tattoos? So you could say, yes, I have them, or no, I don't have them. So you could say something like, sí, los tengo, or no, no los tengo. You're using the direct object pronouns like you did in the previous segment. On number 3, it says, ¿Qué les da a los estudiantes? What did he or she give to them? She gave them the information, or something like that. Try your best. I know that direct objects and indirect object pronouns are very confusing, so please don't get discouraged if this is a more difficult concept for you to understand. We will practice a lot in class, and we'll do some warm-up activities before you take the Flip Mini Quiz. So have a positive attitude. I know this is a difficult grammar point to understand, but I hope that you will be able to understand it by the end of class tomorrow. Adios. Have a good day.